It seems like this, I don't know, still getting used to this. So I'm doing this by streaming live on YouTube, and then it'll save the file, and I can create a playlist, like YouTube playlist of videos, like past recordings. And the reason I'm doing it that way is because I don't think the internet here in Japan can. I don't trust it to upload a video. Like if I just recorded the video myself and then uploaded it, I wouldn't trust it to fully upload. So I feel like if I stream it and then just save a copy of it, it's the best way to do this for now. But it's also really weird when it starts, because it starts and it says I've already been streaming for 5 seconds, and then I feel like there's much nothing. But then it deletes like the first 10 seconds, and it looks like you're getting a start point of randomness. But yeah. Picking up exactly where we just left off. I figure I'm gonna make these each like 20 to 30 minutes, because I don't want, if they're too short, then it feels like there's too many, but if they're too long, then it also feels like, I don't know, it just feels like you'll get lost. If I make like a playlist and you can just play them in order, I feel like it'll work very well, where even if you fall asleep or something, you can pick back up where you left off. And if you don't like that, you can tell me if I can do a better system in the future, and I'll do better. I'll do something you prefer. Yeah. I love you, babe. I miss you so much. Back to the book. Where the Red Fern Grows, Chapter 3. The dog-wanting disease never did leave me altogether. With the new work I was doing, helping Papa, it just kind of burned itself down and left a big sore on my heart. Every time I'd see a coon tracked down in our fields, or along the riverbanks, the old sore would get all festered up and start hurting again. Just when I had given up all hope of ever owning a good hound, something wonderful happened. The good Lord figured I had heard enough, and it was time to lend a helping hand. It all started one day while I was hoeing corn down in our field close to the river. Across the river, a party of fishermen had been camped for several days. I heard the old Maxwell car as it snorted and chugged its way out of the bottoms. I knew they were leaving. Throwing down my hoe, I ran down to the river and waded across at a place called the Shannon Ford. I hurried to the campground. It was always a pleasure to prowl where fishermen had camped. I usually could find things, a fish line or a forgotten fishing pole. On one occasion, I found a beautiful knife stuck in the bark of a sycamore tree forgotten by a careless fisherman. But on that day, I found the greatest of all treasures, a sportsman's magazine, discarded by the campers. It was a real treasure for a country boy. Because of that magazine, my entire life was changed. I sat down on an old sycamore log and started thumbing through the leaves. On the back pages of the magazine, I came to the for sale section. Dogs for sale. Every kind of dog. I read on, and they had dogs I had never heard of, names I couldn't make out. Far down in the right-hand corner, I found an ad that took my breath away. In small letters, it read, "Registered red-bone coon hound pups, $25 each." The advertisement was from a kennel in Kentucky. I read it over and over. By the time I had memorized the ad, I was seeing dogs, hearing dogs, and even feeling them. The magazine was forgotten. I was lost in thought. The brain of an 11-year-old boy can dream some fantastic dreams. How wonderful it would be if I could have 2 of those pups. Every boy in the country but me had a good hound or 2. But $50? How could I ever get $50? I knew I couldn't expect help from Mama and Papa. I remembered a passage from the Bible my Mama had read to us. God helps those who help themselves. I thought of the words. I mulled them over in my mind. I decided I'd ask God to help me. There on the banks of the Illinois River in the cool shade of the tall white sycamores, I asked God to help me get 2 hound pups. It wasn't much of a prayer, but it had come right from the heart. When I left the campground with the fishermen, it was late. As I walked along, I could feel the hard bulge of the magazine jammed deep in the pocket of my overalls. The beautiful silence that follows the setting sun had settled over the river bottoms. The coolness of the rich, black soil felt good to my bare feet. It was the time of day when all furry things came to life. A big swamp rabbit hopped up on the trail, sat on his haunches, stared at me, and then scampered away. A mother gray squirrel ran out on the limb of a bur oak tree. She barked a warning to the four furry balls behind her. They melted from the sight in the thick green. A silent gray shadow drifted down from the top of a tall sycamore. There was a squeal and a beating of wings. I heard the tinkle of a bell in the distance ahead. I knew it was Daisy, our milk cow. I'd have to start her on the way home. I took the magazine from my pocket and again I read the ad. Slowly a plan began to form. I'd save the money. I could sell stuff to the fishermen, crawfish, minnows, and fresh vegetables. In berry season, I could sell all the berries I could pick at my grandfather's store. I could trap in the winter. The more I planned, the more real it became. There was the way to get those pups. Save my money. I could almost feel the pups in my hands. I planned the little doghouse and where to put it, collars I could make myself. Then the thought came, what could I name them? I tried name after name, voicing them out loud. None seemed to fit. Well, there would be plenty of time for names. Right now, there was something more important. $50. A fabulous sum. A fortune. Far more money than I had ever seen. Somehow, some way, I was determined to have it. I had 23 cents. A dime I had earned running errands for my grandpa, and 13 cents a fisherman had given me for a can of worms. The next morning, I went to the trash pile behind the barn. I was looking for a can. My bank. I picked up several, but they didn't seem to be what I wanted. Then I saw it. An old KC baking powder can. It was perfect, long, and slender, with a good tight lid. I took it down to the creek and scrubbed it with sand until it was bright and new looking. I dropped the 20 cents in the can. The coins looked so small lying there on the shiny bottom, but to me it was a good start. With my finger I tried to measure how full it would be with the $50 in it. Next I went to the barn and up on the loft, far back over the hay and up under the eaves. I hid my can. I had to start toward making my dreams come true. 23 cents. I had a good bank, safe from the rats and from the rain and the snow. All through that summer I worked like a beaver. In the small creek that wormed its way down through our fields, I caught crawfish with my bare hands. I trapped minnows with an old screen wire trap I made myself, baited with yellow corn bread from my mother's kitchen. These are sold to the fishermen, along with fresh vegetables and roasting ears. I tore my way through the blackberry patches until my hands and feet were scratched raw and red from the thorns. I tramped the hills seeking out the huckleberry bushes. My grandfather paid me 10 cents a bucket for my berries. Once Grandpa asked me what I did with the money I earned. I told him I was saving it to buy some hunting dogs. Asked him if he would order them for me when I had saved enough. He said he would. I asked him not to say anything to my father. He promised me he wouldn't. I'm sure Grandpa paid little attention to my plans. That winter I trapped harder than ever with the 3 little traps I owned. Grandpa sold my hides to fur buyers who came to his store all through the fur season. Prices were cheap. 15 cents for a large possum hide, 25 for a good skunk hide. Little by little, the nickels and dimes added up. The old KC baking powder grew very heavy. I would heft its weight in the palm of my hand. With a straw, I'd measure from the lip of the can to the money. As the months went by, the straws grew shorter and shorter. The next summer, I followed the same routine. Would you like to buy some crawfish or minnows? Maybe you'd like some fresh vegetables or roasting ears. The fishermen were wonderful, as true sportsmen are. They seemed to sense the urgency in my voice and always bought my wares. However many was the time I'd find my vegetables left in the abandoned camp. There never was a set price. Anything they offered was good enough for me. A year passed. I was 12. I was over the halfway mark. I had $27.46. My spirits soared. I worked harder. Another year crawled slowly by, and then the great day came. The long, hard grind was over. I had it. My $50. I cried as I counted it over and over. As I set the can back in the shadowy eaves of the barn, it seemed to glow with a radiant whiteness I had never seen before. Perhaps it was all imagination. I don't know. Lying back in the soft hay, I folded my hands behind my head, closed my eyes, and let my mind wander back over the two long years. I thought of the fishermen, the blackberry patches, and the huckleberry hills. I thought of the prayer I had said when I asked God to help me get 2 hound pups. I knew He had surely helped, for He had given me the heart, courage, and determination. Early the next morning, with the can jammed deep in the pocket of my overalls, I flew to the store. As I trotted along, I whistled and sang. I felt as big as the tallest mountain in the Ozarks. Arriving at my destination, I saw 2 wagons were tied up at the hitching rack. I knew some farmers had come to the store, so I waited until they left. As I walked in, I saw my grandfather behind the counter. Tugging and pulling, I worked the can out of my pocket and dumped it in front of him and looked up. Grandpa was dumbfounded. He tried to say something, but it wouldn't come out. He looked at me and he looked at the pile of coins. Finally, in a voice much louder than he ordinarily used, he asked, "Where did you get all this?" "I told you, Grandpa," I said. "I was saving my money so I could buy 2 pups, and I did. You said you would order them for me. I've got the money, and now I want you to order them." Grandpa stared at me over his glasses and then back at the money. "How long have you been saving this?" he asked. "A long time, Grandpa," I said. "How long?" he asked. I told him 2 years. His mouth flew open in a loud voice. He said, "2 years?" I nodded my head. The way my grandfather stared at me made me uneasy. I was on needles and pins. Taking his eyes from me, he glanced back at the money. He saw the faded yellow piece of paper sticking out from the coins. He worked it out, asking as he did, "What's this?" I told him it was the ad, telling where to order my dogs. He read it, turned it over, and glanced at the other side. I saw the astonishment leave his eyes and the friendly old grandfather look come back. I felt much better. Dropping the paper back on the money, he turned, picked up an old turkey feather duster, and started dusting where there was no dust. He kept glancing at me out of the corner of his eye as he walked slowly down to the other end of the store, dusting here and there. He put the duster down, came from behind the counter, and walked up to me. Laying a friendly old work-calloused hand on my head, he changed the conversation altogether, saying, "Son, you need a haircut." I told him I didn't mind. I didn't like my hair short. Flies and mosquitoes bothered me. He glanced down at my bare feet and asked, "How come your feet are cut and scratched like that?" I told him it was pretty tough picking blackberries barefoot. He nodded his head. It was too much for my grandfather. He turned and walked away. I saw the glasses come off and the old red handkerchief come out. I heard the good excuse of blowing his nose. He stood for several seconds with his back toward me. When he turned around, I noticed his eyes were moist. In a quivering voice, he said, "Well, son, it's your money. You worked for it and you worked hard. You got it honestly and you want some dogs. We're going to get those dogs. Be damned, be damned." That was as near as I ever came to hearing my grandfather curse, if you can call it cursing. He walked over and picked up the ad again, asking, "Is this 2 years old too?" I nodded. "Well," he said, "the first thing we have to do is write this outfit. There may not even be a place like this in Kentucky anymore. After all, a lot of things can happen in 2 years." Seeing that I was worried, he said, "Now you go on home. I'll write to these kennels and I'll let you know when I get an answer. If we can't get the dogs there, we can get them someplace else. And I don't think if I were you, I'd let my pa know anything about this right now. I happen to know he wants to buy that red mule from old man Potter." I told him I wouldn't and turned to leave the store. As I reached the door, my grandfather said in a loud voice, "Say, it's been a long time since you've had any candy, hasn't it?" I nodded my head. He asked how long. I told him a long time. "Well," he said, "we'll have to do something about that." Walking over behind the counter, he reached out and got a sack. I noticed it wasn't one of the nickel sacks, it was one of the quarter kind. My eyes never left my grandfather's hand. Time after time, it tipped in and out of the candy counter. Peppermint sips, jawbreakers, horehound, and gumdrops. The sack bulged. So did my eyes. Handing the sack to me, he said, "Here. First big coon you catch with those dogs, you can pay me back." I told him I would. On my way home, with a jawbreaker in one side of my mouth and a piece of horehound in the other, I skipped and hopped, making half an effort to try to whistle and sing, and wouldn't for the candy. I had the finest grandpa in the world, and I was the happiest boy in the world. I wanted to share my happiness with my sisters, but decided to not say anything about ordering the pups. Arriving home, I dumped the sack of candy out in the bed. 6 little hands helped themselves. I was well repaid by the love and adoration I saw in the wide blue eyes of my 3 little sisters. Chapter 4. Day after day, I flew to the store. Grandpa would shake his head. Then on a Monday, as I entered the store, I sensed a change in him. He was in high spirits, talking and laughing with half a dozen farmers. Every time I caught his eye, he would smile and wink at me. I thought the farmers would never leave, but finally the store was empty. Grandpa told me the letter had come. The kennels were still there, and they had dogs for sale. He said he had made the mail buggy wait while he made out the order. And another thing, the dog market had gone downhill. The price of dogs had dropped $5. He handed me a $10 bill. "Now there's still one stump in the way," he said. "The mail buggy can't carry things like dogs. So it'll come as far as the depot at Tahlequah? But you'll get the notice here because I ordered them, in your name." I thanked my grandfather with all my heart and asked him how long I'd have to wait for the notice. He said, "I don't know, but it shouldn't take more than a couple of weeks." I asked him how I was going to get my dogs from Tahlequah. Well, there's always someone going in, he said, and you could ride in with them. That evening, the silence of our supper was interrupted when I asked my father this question. Papa, how far is it to Kentucky? I may as well have exploded a bomb. For an instant, there was complete silence, and then my oldest sister giggled. The two little ones stared at me. With a half-hearted laugh, my father said, Well now, I don't know, but it's a pretty good ways. What do you know? What do you want to know for? Thinking of taking a trip to Kentucky? No, I said. I just wondered. My youngest sister giggled and asked, Can I go with you? I glared at her. Mama broke into the conversation. I declare, what kind of a question is that? How far is it to Kentucky? I don't know what's gotten into that mind of yours lately. You go around like you were lost, and you're losing weight. You're as skinny as a rail. And look at that hair. Just last Sunday they had a haircutting over at Tom Rollin's place, but you couldn't go. You had to go prowling around the river and the woods. I told Mama that I'd get a haircut next time they had a cutting. And I just heard some fellas talking about Kentucky up at the store and wondered how far away it was. Much to my relief, the conversation was ended. The days dragged by. A week passed and still no word about the dogs. Terrible thoughts ran through my mind. Maybe my dogs were lost. The train had a wreck. Someone stole my money. Perhaps the mailman lost my order. Then at the end of the second week, the notice came. My grandfather told me he had talked to Jim Hodges that day. He was going into town in about a week, and I could ride in with him to pick up my dogs. Again, I thanked my grandfather. I started for home. Walking along in deep thought, I decided it was time to tell my father the whole story. I fully intended to tell him that evening. I tried several times, but somehow I couldn't. I wasn't scared of him, for he never whipped me. He was always kind and gentle. But for some reason, I don't know why, I just couldn't tell him. That night, snuggled deep in the soft folds of a feather bed, I lay thinking. I had waited so long for my dogs, and I so desperately wanted to see them and hold them. I didn't want to wait a whole week. In a flash, I made up my mind. Very quietly, I got up and put on my clothes. I sneaked into the kitchen and got one of Mama's precious flour sacks. In it, I put 6 eggs, some leftover cornbread, a little salt, and a few matches. Next, I went to the smokehouse and cut off a piece of salt pork. I stopped at the barn and picked up a gunny sack. I put the flour sack into the gunny sack. This I rolled up and crammed lengthwise in a bib of my overalls. I was on my way. I was going after my dogs. Tahlequah was a small country town with a population of about 800. By the road, it was 32 miles away, but as the crow flies, it was only 20 miles. I went as the crow flies, straight through the hills. Although I had never been to town in my life, I knew what direction to take. Tahlequah and the railroad lay on the other side of the river from our place. I had the Frisco Railroad on my right and the Illinois River on my left. Not far from where the railroad crossed the river lay the town of Tahlequah. I knew if I bore to the right, I would find the railroad, and if I bore to the left, I had the river to guide me. Sometime that night, I crossed the river on a riffle somewhere in the Dripping Springs country. Coming out of the river bottoms, I scattered up a long hogback ridge and broke out on top of the flats. In a mile-eating trot, I moved along. I had the wind of a deer, the muscles of a country boy, a heart full of dog love, and a strong determination. I wasn't scared of the darkness or the mountains, for I was raised in those mountains. On and on, mile after mile, I moved along. I saw faint gray streaks appear in the east. I knew daylight was close. My bare feet were getting sore from the flint rocks and saw briars. I stopped beside a mountain stream, soaked my feet in the cool water, rested for a spell, and then started on. After leaving the mountain stream, my pace was much slower. The muscles of my legs were getting stiff. Feeling the pains of hunger gnawing at my stomach, I decided I would stop and eat at the next stream I found. Then I remembered I had forgotten to include a can in which to boil my eggs. I stopped and built a small fire, cutting off a nice thick slab of salt pork, and I roasted it. And with a piece of cornbread, made a sandwich. Putting out my fire, I was on my way again. I ate as I trotted along. I felt much better. I came into Tahlequah from the northeast, at the outskirts of town. I hid my flour sack and provisions, keeping the gunny sack. I walked into town. I was scared of Tahlequah and the people. I'd never seen such a big town and so many people. There was store after store, some of them 2 stories high. The wagon yard had wagons on top of wagons, teams, buggies, and horses. 2 young ladies about my age stopped, stared at me, and then giggled. My blood boiled, but I could understand. After all, I had 3 sisters. They couldn't help it because they were women folks. I went on. I saw a big man coming up the street. The bright shiny star on his vest looked as big as a bucket. I saw the long, black gun at his side, and I froze in my tracks. I'd heard of sheriffs and marshals, but had never seen one. Stories repeated about them in the mountains told how fast they were with a gun, and how many men they had killed. The closer he came, the more frightened I got. I knew it was the end for me. I could just see him aiming his big black gun and shooting me between the eyes. It seemed like a miracle that he passed by, hardly glancing at me. Breathing a sigh, I walked on, seeing the wonders of the world. Passing a large store window, I stopped and stared. There in the window was the most wonderful sight I had ever seen. Everything under the sun: overalls, jackets, bolts of beautiful cloth, new harnesses, collars, brittles. Then my eyes did pop open. There were several guns. One of them had 2 barrels. I couldn't believe it. 2 barrels. I had seen several guns, but never one with 2 barrels. Then I saw something else. The sun was just right, and the plate glass was a perfect mirror. I saw the full reflection of myself for the first time in my life. I could see that I did look a little odd. My straw-colored hair was long and shaggy. It was bushed out like a corn tassel that had been hit by a wind. I tried to smooth it down with my hands. This helped some, but not much. What it needed was a good combing, and I had no comb. My overalls were patched and faded, but they were clean. My shirt had pulled out. I tucked it back in. I took one look at my bare feet and winced. They were as brown as dead sycamore leaves. The spiderweb pattern of raw red scratches looked odd on the saddle brown skin. I thought, well, I won't have to pick any more blackberries, and the scratches would soon go away. I pumped up one of my arms and thought surely the muscle was going to pop right through my thin blue shirt. I stuck out my tongue. It was as red as pokeberry juice, and anything that color was supposed to be healthy. After making a few faces at myself, I put my thumbs in my ears and was making mule ears when 2 old women came by. They stopped and stared at me. I stared back. As they turned to go on their way, I heard one of them say something to the other. The words were hard to catch, but I did hear one word: wild. As I said before, they couldn't help it. They were women folks. As I turned to leave, my eyes again fell on the overalls, bolts of cloth. I thought of my mother, father, and sisters. Here was an opportunity to make amends for leaving home without telling anyone. I entered the store. I bought a pair of overalls for Papa. After telling the storekeeper how big my mother and sisters were, I bought several yards of cloth. I also bought a large sack of candy. Glancing down at my bare feet, the storekeeper said, "I have some good shoes." I told him I didn't need any shoes. He asked if that would be all. I nodded. He added up the bill. I handed him my $10. He gave me my change. After wrapping up the bundles, he helped me put them in my sack. Lifting it to my shoulder, I turned and left the store. Out on the street, I picked out a friendly-looking little man and asked him where the depot was. He told me to go down the last street and turn right. Go as far as I could, and I couldn't miss it. I thanked him and started on my way. Leaving the main part of town, I started up a long street through the residential section. I had never seen so many beautiful horses, and they were all different colors. The lawns were neat and clean and looked like green carpets. I saw a man pushing some kind of a mowing mop to watch the whirling blades. He gawked at me. I hurried on. I heard a lot of shouting and laughing ahead of me. Not wanting to miss anything, I walked a little faster. I saw what was making the noise. More kids than I'd ever seen were playing around a big red brick building. I thought some rich man lived there and was giving a party for his children. Walking up to the edge of the playground, I stopped to watch. The boys and girls were about my age, and were as thick as flies around a sorghum hill. They were milling, running, and jumping. Teeter-totters and swings were loaded down with them. Everyone was laughing and having a big time. Over against the building, a large blue pipe ran up on an angle from the ground. A few feet from the top, there was a bend in it. The pipe seemed to go into the building. Boys were crawling into its dark mouth. I counted 9 of them. One boy stood about 6 feet from the opening with a stick in his hand, staring goggle-eyed, trying to figure out what they were doing. I got a surprise. Out of the hollow pipe spurted a boy. He sailed through the air and lit on his feet. The boy with the stick marked the ground where he landed. All 9 of them came shooting out, one behind the other. As each boy landed, a new mark was scratched. They gained around, looking at the lines. There was a lot of loud talking, pointing, and arguing. Then all lines were erased and a new scorekeeper was picked out. The others crawled back into the pipe. I figured out how the game was played. After climbing to the top of the slide, the boys turned around and sat down. One at a time, they came flying down and out, feet first. The one that shot out the furthest was the winner. I thought how wonderful it would be if I could slide down just one time. One boy, spying me standing on the corner, came over. Looking me up and down, he asked, "Do you go to school here?" I said, school. He said, sure, school. What do you think it was? Oh, no, I don't go to school here. Do you go to Jefferson? No, I don't go there either. Don't you go to school at all? Sure, I go to school. Where? At home? You go to school at home? I nodded. What grade are you in? I said I wasn't in any grade. Puzzled, he said, you go to school at home and don't know what grade you're in. Who teaches you? My mother. What does she teach you? I said, reading, writing, and arithmetic. And I'm as good as it as you are. Yes. Don't you have any shoes? I said, sure, I have shoes. Why aren't you wearing them? I don't wear shoes until it gets cold. He laughed and asked where I lived. I said, back in the hills. He said, oh, you're a hillbilly. He ran back to the mob. I saw him pointing at me and talking to several boys. They started my way, yelling, hillbilly, hillbilly. Just before they reached me, a bell started ringing. Turning, they ran to the front of the building, lined up in 2 long lines, and marching like little tin soldiers disappeared inside the school. The playground was silent. I was all alone and felt lonely and sad. I heard a noise on my right. I didn't have to turn around to recognize what it was. Someone was using a hoe. I'd know that sound if I heard it on a dark night. It was a little old, white-headed woman working in a flower bed. Looking again at the long blue pipe, I thought, there's no one around. Maybe I could have one slide anyway. I eased over and looked up into the dark hollow. It looked scary, but I thought of all the other boys I had seen crawl into it. I could see the last mark on the ground and thought, I bet I can beat that. Laying my sack down, I started climbing up. The farther I went, the darker and more scary it got. Just as I reached the top, my feet slipped. Down I sailed. All the way down, I tried to grab onto something, but there was nothing to grab. I'm sure some great champions had slid out of that pipe, and no doubt more than one world record had been broken. But if someone had been there when I came out, I know the record I set would stand today in all its glory. I came out, I went in. Feet first and belly down. My legs were spread out like a bean shooter sock, arms flailing there, and I zoomed out and up. I seemed to hang suspended in the air at the peak of my climb. I could see the hard-packed ground far below. As I started down, I shut my eyes tight and gritted my teeth. This didn't seem to help. With a splattering sound, I landed. I felt the air whoosh out between my teeth. I tried to scream, but I had no wind left to make a sound. After bouncing a couple of times, I finally settled down to earth. I lay spread-eagled for a few seconds, then slowly got to my knees. Hearing loud laughter, I looked around. It was the little old lady with the hoe in her hand. She hollered and asked how I liked it. Without answering, I grabbed up my gunny sack and left. Far up the street, I looked back. The little old lady was sitting down, rocking with laughter. I couldn't understand these town people. If they weren't staring at a fellow, they were laughing at him. Alright, that's it for this part. Hello. I hope you have a good night.